Probably one of the most popular things to home can, next to pickles and tomatoes, is peaches. In fact, peaches are probably the first home canned thing I've ever personally seen, and I know it's even been referenced in all manner of pop culture, including an episode of The Simpsons from, probably 20 years ago at this point. But anyway, it's an incredibly common way to preserve peaches from a summer harvest, and it's really quite easy to do. As far as canning recipes go, this one's very straightforward. We need to make a simple sugar syrup, we need to do a few things to the peaches themselves, and then it's all coming together and we're canning them up into some quart jars. So we're going to get right into it and go through every step of preparing and processing a whole bunch of fresh peaches. Here we've got just over 8 pounds of peaches, and this is going to be just enough to make 4 quarts, or 8 pints, of our canned peach slices. And it's ideal to use peaches that are not quite ripe, because they'll be more firm and that will make them a little easier to work with and have a nicer looking final product. Incidentally, some of these peaches here are actually quite ripe, which resulted in them being a little scraggly looking in the jars because they started off much softer. They'll still be perfectly delicious, but they don't necessarily look as pretty as they could have had I started with less ripe peaches. And I'll mention that some people like to do peach halves, but I can fit way more peach into each jar if I halve them and then cut each half into thirds. But before we do that, we need to remove the peels, and the easiest way to do that is by blanching. So I'll slice a very shallow crisscross slit into the bottom of each peach, which will make it very easy to grab and remove the peels. Then those peaches are going into a pot of boiling water for only about 1 minute, and I'll only do a few at a time to not overcrowd the pot, which will both bring down the water temperature too much and also risk having the first peaches to go in be boiling for a lot longer than a minute. After a minute, those peaches are coming out and going right into an ice water bath. This will stop the cooking process and also loosen those skins even more. As you can see, the skins will now come off incredibly easy. So after all my peaches are blanched and cooled in the ice water bath, I'll just go ahead and pull the skins off the rest of them. And now they're ready to slice up. I'll first cut the peach all the way around from top to bottom. I'll just let the knife follow all the way around the pit, and then it's pretty easy to split the whole thing in half. Then I'll just pluck that pit out of there, and now I can go ahead and cut each half into 3 relatively even slices. Now to make our simple syrup. I'm going with a pretty light syrup. That is, the ratio of sugar to water is pretty light. You can definitely do a heavier syrup by adding more sugar if you like, but peaches are already very sweet, and this is just perfect in my opinion. All I need to do is combine 6 cups of water with 2 cups of sugar, which is enough for a batch this size, but since I'm going to be making a whole second batch of peaches after this video, I'm going to double my syrup right now. Now I just need to stir it up and let it come to a simmer for a few minutes to get it nice and hot and ensure all the sugar is dissolved. I'll mention that you can your peaches with just water, but a light sugar syrup is going to help your canned peaches retain their flavor and color for longer in the jars, but it's totally up to you. In the meantime, I've been getting my jars prepared. Since we're using a hot water bath for canning, and the processing time isn't especially long, I'll go ahead and sterilize my jars by boiling them for a few minutes. This will also get them nice and hot, which is ideal since we're going to be putting very hot peaches and syrup into them. And when I'm just about ready to put the peaches into the syrup, I'll carefully drain those jars and set them on a towel on the counter. Because the next step is pretty quick and I want my jars to be ready. After the syrup has been simmering for a few minutes, in go the peaches. Again, it's best to not totally overcrowd the pot with peach slices, so I'll do them in a couple batches, basically about 1 quart jar's worth at a time. I'll let the slices simmer in that syrup for 1 full minute, pretty much just enough time to get them pretty hot. Then I'm scooping them out and they're going right into a jar. And I'll just repeat the whole thing with my peach slices until all 4 jars are filled. And as they settle a bit, I'll end up adding a couple more additional slices to each jar. Now for the syrup. I'll ladle the syrup into each jar, filling them almost to the top, but leaving a full ½ inch of headspace. And to make sure it's a ½ inch, I'll use my Headspace measuring tool to check, and it looks like I need a little more syrup in all 4 of the jars. Now that's looking good, so my next step is to debubble. Using the other end of my Headspace measuring tool, I'll gently run it along the inside walls of each jar with the aim of knocking loose any big air bubbles that may be trapped down in there. This can be tricky to do with jars packed tight full of peaches because I don't want to squish or pierce any of them, so I'll just do the best I can. Next is the very important step of wiping the jar rims. Using a damp paper towel, I'll very thoroughly wipe the top edge of each jar to make sure there is no food residue at all on there. Especially since I used sticky, sugary syrup, I need to make sure there is nothing that will obstruct a proper seal between the jar and the lid. I've got my lids heated up to a low simmer in this little saucepan, and now I'll just set them in place on each jar. I'll mention that the Ball Company no longer recommends boiling the lids like they used to, as it can apparently damage the rubber seal. I still heat them up in water, but not to boiling temperature. And now the rings. I'll screw on each metal ring until snug, but not ultra cranked down. Finger tight is all you need. Now these jars are ready to go in the canner, but there's one more thing I need to check first. The objective with canning like this is to have your jars and the canner pretty close to the same temperature. These jars are hot, and the water in my canner is still quite warm from boiling the jars a little while ago. If the temperatures are too far apart, you risk the glass breaking. So something I started doing a couple years ago is checking the temps with a cheap infrared thermometer. I can see that the outside of these jars are about 134 degrees Fahrenheit, and the water in my canner is currently about 148 degrees. That's probably close enough to be safe, but I'll throw a few ice cubes in there anyway to bring the canner temp down just a little more. And that's close enough for me. So I'll start carefully setting each jar under the water with my jar lifter tool, making sure the jars aren't touching each other or the outside walls of the canner. And by the way, since I started doing this with the infrared thermometer, I have not broken a single jar. I didn't break a lot of jars previously, but it was definitely a number greater than 0. Now the jars are in place, and I can see that my water level is comfortably higher than the top of the jars. So now to crank the heat up to high, put on the lid, and bring this water to a boil. Once the water is at a full rolling boil, the processing time has officially begun. For quart jars, these peaches need 25 minutes to process. If I was using pint jars, they would need 20 minutes. Okay, 25 minutes is up, so the heat is off, and I'll remove the canner lid. I'll let these jars sit for about 5 more minutes before removing them, just to let the temp start coming down a little bit. And now I'm just carefully transferring them over to a towel on the counter. The towel is here to not only protect my counter from the hot jars, but to also protect the hot jars from the relatively cool counter. Now there's only one thing left to do, and that's wait. I'll let these jars sit here until they're completely down to room temperature, which will take several hours. And over the next little while, I'll start hearing the lids of each one pop, signifying a sealed jar and a successful canning. And as always, if any of the lids do not pop, that means the seal was not successful, and I cannot consider that jar to be shelf stable. I could put on a new lid and reprocess, but on the rare occasion that I have a failed seal, I'll just throw that jar into the fridge and use it within a week or two. All 4 of these are sealed successfully, so once everything is 100% cooled, I'll remove the rings, give the jars a rinse in case there's any sticky syrup residue on them, and they're ready to store in the pantry, and I will have some delicious peach slices to eat whenever I want. So that's about it. Be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future canning and food preservation videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.